Hello and good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us and tuning in. We are back in the book of Numbers. Last week we saw how the Israelites were on the very doorstep of the Promised Land, and they had this opportunity to go in, fulfill God's commands, start driving out the inhabitants and start taking possession of the land. But, there's always a but in the book of Numbers. But they decide that they are not going to trust God. They saw how the people were strong, fortified cities, they were giants. And so they decided not to go into the land. And God condemned that generation to wander in the wilderness for 40 years until they were all died off, and their children would go into the land. And so that's where we were left off last week. As you can tell, maybe, this is not a live recording this time. This is a live recording. This is not a live stream this time. This is a recording. I was not able to be here for this evening. So this is recorded. I hope you didn't have any trouble finding it on Facebook if you are finding it on Facebook. So we are in Numbers chapter 15. This is right after Israel's horrible defeat at the hand of the Amalekites and Canaanites after they tried to go into the land after being told that the consequences for their choice. And God had already told them to go back into the wilderness and get to walking, and they still rebelled. So in chapter 15 we have some more regulations given, laws about sacrifices and unintentional sins, and we start to get this general pattern. It started kind of in Exodus and it's carried over into Numbers, and that is the pattern of when Israel rebels, God gives them laws to follow. They rebel, God gives them laws to help them in their pursuit of hopefully they're trying to be holy. They rebel again, He gives them more laws. They rebel again, He gives them more laws, and it goes on and on and on until they actually get into the Promised Land. So these laws from chapter 15 verse 1 all the way to the end of chapter 15, we'll give some highlights. There's some regulations about laws and sacrifices, the Israelites and the permanent resident foreigners, if that makes sense. It's people who are not Israelites, but they still live amongst the Israelites. They both bring the same offering. God gives the same rule to each one of them, and you can see that in verse 16. He says, "One law and one rule shall be for you and for the stranger who sojourns with you." He also gives regulations about the contribution of the first bread that is to be eaten in the land. Now this was not an annual thing. This was literally just the first bread that they baked in the land. So it says in verse 19, "When you eat of the bread of the land, you shall present a contribution to the Lord. Of the first of your dough, you shall present a loaf as a contribution, like a contribution from the threshing floor. So you shall present it. Some of the first of the dough you shall give to the Lord as a contribution throughout your generations." Well, I guess it was an annual thing then, throughout your generations. My bad. I misspoke, I guess. I misremembered. We also get some laws about unintentional sins, kind of like that one. I just told you an unintentional lie, but I corrected myself. Unintentional sins, it's specifically if it was by mistake. Again, we look at this matter in the book of Leviticus. There's a difference between unintentional sin and intentional sin. Unintentional sin, of course, like how the word sounds, you're not meaning to do it. You're not doing it on purpose. You didn't premeditate this. It was an accident. It was by mistake. Intentional sin, of course, you're meaning to do it. You know that it's wrong, and yet you still do it. And there is actually nothing in the law of Moses that makes room for intentional sins. Instead, it gives death penalties for them. So unintentional sins is what the sacrifices were meant to correct. Like we said way back when in the book of Leviticus, there is a big difference between someone who is trying to live and follow God's law, His word, His will, and someone who says, I just don't care. Someone who says they are trying to follow Jesus and they make mistakes, and someone who says they're trying to follow Jesus and then they just don't care about their behavior. They're just going to do whatever they want. There's a big difference between these two people, and God knows the difference between those two people. So if a sin is made unintentionally, a sacrifice is needed, but after that it is not held against them. Numbers chapter 15, verses 22 through 31. Also, this very interesting one, this is from verses 37 through 41. Israel is told to have these little tassels on their garments. Now, exactly what that looks like, as far as we know, it's at the corner of their garments. So I guess where it's sewn together, and that would be probably right here, because Israel had a law that they could only make their garments out of a single piece of fabric. They couldn't make it out of multiple pieces. So they would wear, a cloak would just be a cloak. It's one piece of fabric that has a part in the middle. But for a tunic, like a shirt, the seam would be on one side and they would have a little tassel. Like God tells them here, they would need to make this tassel, and it is to remind them about their commitment, their responsibility to be faithful to the commandments of the Lord and to do them, and not to follow after their own hearts or their own eyes. That is in verse 39. It's a thing, it's a physical thing, a tactile thing that would remind them of their responsibility to God. On a side note, have you ever watched the movie The Fiddler on the Roof? There's this line where the main character says, he looks at the camera, or audience if it's in theatrical version, but he looks at the camera and he brings up, the whole town is Jewish, he brings up, we wear these little prayer shawls to remind ourselves of to remind ourselves to be holy to God. That's what he says. And then he mentions who started this. I don't know, it's just tradition. Well, actually, that kind of thing comes from this in the book of Numbers. They were told to have these little tassels on their garments so that whenever they saw the tassels, or maybe you just absentmindedly reach for it, because you do that, as one does, you're reminded that you have this obligation to be faithful to the commandments of the Lord. There is something to be said about having something like that. Some people in the church, and I mean like in the church, have something against wearing a cross, like on a necklace or on a bracelet or something. Why? As Paul says, if it's not like wrong, and it's not going to lead you astray, is there anything actually wrong with it? And I'm not talking about like rosary beads here, because that's another matter. That something like that, which was a tradition, eventually became forced onto people as doctrine. That's a different thing. But just having something on your person that throughout your day reminds you about your responsibility to be holy to God. Paul says, if it helps you be holy to God, and it's not wrong, then yeah, more power to you, right? So that's a very interesting thing. But you might notice I skipped over a little portion, and that is verses 32 through 36. In verse 32, while the people of Israel were in the wilderness, they're still in Paran, by the way, they found a man gathering sticks on the Sabbath day. And those who found him gathering sticks brought him to Moses and Aaron and to all the congregation, and they put him in custody because it had not yet been made clear what should be done with him. And the Lord said to Moses, "You will put the man to death. All the congregation shall stone him with stones outside the camp." And the congregation brought him outside the camp, and they stoned him to death with stones, as the Lord commanded Moses. Yikes. This person is known as a Sabbath breaker. That was a very bad crime. What is the word? Serious crime to commit in Israel, to be a Sabbath breaker. The Lord said the whole assembly needs to stone him to death with stones, and it just shows God was serious about his word being followed. He was serious, and he still is serious about his word being followed. He doesn't command us to stone to death those who break his commandments, but he is still very serious, as you can see again in Hebrews chapter 12, verses 25 through 29. It says, "See that you do not refuse him who is speaking, for if they did not escape when they refused him who warned on the earth, how much less will we escape if we reject him who warns from heaven? At that time his voice shook the earth, but now he has promised, yet once more I will shake not only the earth, but also the heavens." This phrase, "yet once more," indicates the removal of things that are shaken. That is, things that have been made, in order that the things that cannot be shaken may remain. Therefore, let us be grateful for receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken, and thus let us offer to God acceptable worship with reverence and awe, for our God is a consuming fire. God was serious about his commandments being obeyed then. God is serious about his commandments being obeyed now. Like I said, he doesn't command his people to stone to death those who break God's commands, but they don't get away with it. No one does. No one gets away with it. The Hebrew writer just said, look, they didn't get away with it back then, and it was the one who warned on the earth. Now he warns from heaven. How much more so would you not get away with it? Therefore, take it seriously, give God reverence and awe, and actually listen and follow his word. Then in Numbers chapter 16 and 17, we have a very famous part of the book of Numbers, probably almost as well known as Numbers 13 through 14, when they failed to enter the land because they listened to the 10 spies who gave the bad report. And this is Korah's rebellion. In Numbers 16, a sizable portion of Israel's leadership, led by a Kohathite named Korah, rebel against Moses and Aaron. And you see this in verse 3. They assembled themselves together against Moses and against Aaron, and they said to them, "You've gone too far, for all in the congregation are holy, every one of them, and the Lord is among them. Why then do you exalt yourselves above the assembly of the Lord?" You see, Korah and his company are operating on a couple of misunderstandings. One is that Moses and Aaron made these decisions themselves. They say, "You, Moses and Aaron, have gone too far." What are they talking about? Well, it's probably in reference to this Sabbath breaker incident when they put him to death. And it looked like Moses and Aaron made that decision. They didn't, and they didn't go too far. They went just as far as the Lord had commanded them. That's the one thing that Korah and his company get wrong here. But the other thing is when they say, why then do you, Moses and Aaron, exalt yourselves above the assembly of the Lord? And there it is. They're thinking Moses and Aaron put themselves in this position of authority, when in reality it is God who put them in that position. And so Moses' response is twofold. One, he explains that God is going to put these two parties, Korah and his company and Moses and Aaron, to the test to see who is the one. He says in verse 5, he said to Korah and all his company, in the morning the Lord will show who is his and who is holy, and will bring him near to him. The one whom he chooses, he will bring near to him. Do this, he says, take censers, Korah and all of his company, and put fire in them, and put incense on them before the Lord tomorrow, and the man whom the Lord chooses shall be the holy one. And then he says, this is the second thing he responds with. He gives an exhortation, a warning. He says, you have gone too far, sons of Levi. Moses said to Korah, hear now, sons of Levi, is it too small a thing for you that the God of Israel has separated you, made you holy, from the congregation of Israel, to bring you near to himself, to do the service in the tabernacle of the Lord, and to stand before the congregation to minister to them, and that he has brought you near him, and all your brothers, the sons of Levi, with you? And would you seek the priesthood also? Therefore it is against the Lord that you and all your company have gathered together. What is Aaron that you grumble against him? So here we have it. Moses gets right to the heart of the matter. Sons of Levi, you Korah and his company, you are not appreciating the fact that God has set you apart from the rest of Israel. You guys have been made really special. It's something you should appreciate. But also, he says, you guys are after the priesthood. You're trying to not usurp Aaron, but you're trying to usurp the decision that God made in his personnel. Thus, he says, you are against God. It is against God that you and all your company have gathered together. They're thinking, we're gathering against Moses and Aaron because we think they exalted themselves. And Moses reveals, you're not gathering against us, Moses and Aaron. We're just guys. You're gathering against the Lord who put us here. Yikes. That's not good. So how does it go? Starting in verse 18, how does it go? Verse 18, every man took his censer and put fire in it and laid incense on them and stood at the entrance of the tent of meeting with Moses and Aaron. Then Korah assembled all the congregation against them at the entrance of the tent of meeting. And the glory of the Lord appeared to all the congregation. The glory of the Lord appearing has only happened a couple of times in the book of Numbers, usually in context of when the people are rebelling and God appears to shut them up. This happened when Miriam and Aaron were rebelling against God in the context of they wanted to have their power struggle with Moses. And it also happened when the congregation of Israel was going to kill Joshua and Caleb and Moses and Aaron when they were not able to enter the land anymore. The glory of the Lord showed up so that everyone stopped what they were doing. And here it happens again. The glory of the Lord appeared to all the congregation. And the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, separate yourselves from among this congregation, that I may consume them in a moment. And they fell on their faces and said, O God, the God of the spirits and all of flesh, shall one man sin, and will you be angry with all the congregation? And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, say to the congregation, get away from the dwelling place of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. So here we have this matter. Korah almost gets everyone killed. Whoa. Korah almost gets everyone killed, and it's a good thing that Moses and Aaron were there to intercede on behalf of the people. God, don't take it out on everyone, just take it out on the people who were actually responsible for this rebellion. This is a recurring theme. You might have detected it already. It is the actions of a portion of Israel affects the entire congregation of Israel. And then we have the 10 spies who gave the bad report, and there are 2 spies that gave the good report, but Israel said, we want to listen to those 10 spies, and that resulted in the congregation of Israel having to wander around the wilderness for 40 whole years until the generation died off. Here we have Korah and his company almost got everyone killed. And we're going to also see Moses warns Reuben and Gad when they went to settle down on the east side of the Jordan instead of the west. He's going to tell them, if you guys do this and you don't help us take the rest of the land, then the entire nation is going to die again because of you. So a portion of God's people affecting the whole of God's people, they either make it together or they break it together, and that is a recurring theme in the book of Numbers. It's at least a sub-theme. The main theme is that even while they're all rebelling all the time, God is helping them and caring for them all the time. That's the main theme of Numbers. So, Korah and his company, as God has told them to separate themselves from their tents, they're left standing alone. And Moses says, here is how you will know if they are the ones God wants or if we are the ones God wants. Moses says in verse 28, hereby you shall know that the Lord has sent me to do all these works, and that it has not been of my own accord. If these men die as all men die, or if they are visited by the fate of all mankind, then the Lord has not sent me. But if the Lord creates something new, and the ground opens its mouth and swallows them up with all their belongings, and they go down alive into Sheol, then you shall know that these men have despised the Lord. Essentially, Moses says, hey, if they just grow old and die, or they get sick or something, or they die, they fall in battle later, you'll know that you'll know that God didn't send me, but I elevated myself. That's what Korah thought, right? But if God makes something new, if he makes the ground open up and swallow them alive, it's kind of terrifying, then you will know I did not elevate myself, God elevated me, and it was his decision. Of course, if you know this passage, you'll know that the ringleaders of this rebellion are all swallowed up by the earth as it opens itself up to gobble them up, and they go down alive into Sheol. Now Sheol is, in Hebrew thought, the realm of the dead, and they believed it was right underground, like just below the deepest part where you could dig, and that's kind of why we bury people instead of burning them. That's also why they had a law against cremation, because they believed that you need to go down into Sheol to have, the afterlife, and so they buried people. They also believed that the ocean led right down into Sheol too, which, thinking about how deep it is, you might see how they would believe that. So these men get swallowed by the earth, and the ground closes up above them, and the way it sounds, because it says they went down alive, makes it sound like they were trapped under there and they perish underneath the ground. That is terrifying. But that is the fate of these men who sought to rebel and usurp not Moses and Aaron, but the decision that God had made himself for who is in what position. Yikes. Kind of puts into perspective that kind of thing happening nowadays, how serious that actually is. So, after this, verses 41 through 50, you would expect, oh, I forgot also, the 250 chiefs of the people who sided with Korah also died. They didn't get swallowed by the earth, but they just combusted, and they died in a blaze of fire, which is also terrifying. In verses 41 through 50, you would expect the people to say, "Ah, yes, we see now, indeed, Moses and Aaron, you were put in this position by God, and therefore we should respect you and your authority because we respect God's authority." But no, because this is Israel and this is the book of Numbers, they rebel again, and they say, "Moses and Aaron, you should not have done that." That's essentially what they say. And a plague kills 14,000 of them in that instance. Not great. Not great. So in Numbers chapter 17, in order to stop this kind of rebellion, this kind of the people rising up to try and get Aaron out of the priesthood because they think he put him there himself, or Moses put him there, because Aaron is Moses' brother, you would understand their suspicion. Aaron is miraculously affirmed by God. And the way that they do this, this is in chapter 17 again. The way that they do this is Moses gathers all the staffs from the chiefs of the tribes of Israel, so 12 staffs, because there's 12 tribes. And Aaron's staff is among them because Aaron is the chief of the tribe of Levi. He's the high priest, but he's also the chief. A lot of responsibility for Aaron, you understand. And Moses leaves those staves in the tabernacle overnight. And then in the morning, he goes in and he takes the staves out. Staves. And he shows them to the congregation. 11 of them are exactly the same as when he put them in, but one, Aaron's staff, has budded. There are leaves and flowers coming out of it. And it has produced ripe almonds overnight. Overnight. So God has miraculously confirmed Aaron as the high priest in front of everybody. Everybody understands it now. And this staff that budded is actually kept in the tabernacle from then on as a reminder to the people, but also especially to the Levites who helped in the tabernacle, that Aaron and his descendants are the priests. The Levites are not all priests. Aaron and his descendants are the priests. And to layer that teaching, that reminder on top, we have in Numbers chapter 18 and then on to 19 some more regulations. Again, you hold the pattern. Israel rebels, God gives them laws. Israel rebels, God gives them laws. You get it. And some highlights of this, the first of which, Aaron and his sons are in charge of the priestly duties. The other Levites can help, but they cannot touch the vessels and the holy things in the tabernacle. They cannot do the priestly rites. That is for Aaron and his sons and their descendants. We call the tribe of Levi the priestly tribe, and we do that simply because the priests came from Levi. But the fact of the matter is, not every Levite was a priest. Only Aaron and his descendants, we call it the Aaronic family. Not ironic, but Aaronic family or Aaronic priesthood. They are the priests, not all the other Levites. And God wanted to remind them of that. Because why did Korah's rebellion happen? Korah was a Levite, but he wasn't an Aaronic Levite, and he wanted to be the priest. So God made it so that they would all be reminded, yes, you are special. You Levites are special. But you're not the priests. Remember that. The priests are also, this is another highlight, they're given every contribution and dedicated thing as their portion. They were not allowed to own land. All the Levites lived in certain cities. The high priests and the priests were not allowed to own land. And this is something that really sets the law of Moses apart from other law codes in that time and place, because priests generally in ancient societies were the most wealthy people, because you had a high position of authority, and on top of that you had also the normal process of accruing wealth. You can own land, you can have farms, you can hire people and all of that. You could produce wealth for yourself as a priest and have that high position of authority, which could also accrue more wealth. Priests were way powerful, almost as powerful as kings in the ancient world, but not so in Israel, because the priests in Israel could not own land. The Levites couldn't own land really either. They couldn't have that normal way of accruing wealth, and so their portion in the promised land was instead whatever was contributed and dedicated to the Lord. Instead of an inheritance in the promised land, like I said, the Levites, all the tribe of Levi, were given a tenth of everything that the other tribes produced. So they had 1/10 of everything that Israel produced, which I guess is technically more than all the other tribes would get, because all the other tribes would get a 12th, and Levi would get a 10th. I guess that math checks out. And I say 10th instead of tithe. We have taken it to calling it a tithe because apparently some words in the Bible deserve to be archaic and kind of lose most of their meaning in our minds, while others do not. Don't get me started on that. But it is a tenth of everything that Israel produced. Not just their money, but also their food, their animals, their, I don't know, fill in the blank, paper products, if they make paper, a tenth of the paper. Everything that they produced. The Levites, by the way, were also to make a contribution out of that contribution to the priests. So I guess the Levites actually took home 9/100ths of the total produce of Israel. That's some complicated math right there. But all of this was considered a contribution. To give the tenth, for any Joe Israelite to give their tenth to the Levites, it was considered a contribution. But like I said, also the Levites were also to make contribution out of that contribution to the priesthood, and ultimately the only ones who didn't make contributions were the priests themselves, because it would have just gone to them anyway. The priests didn't make contributions because all the contributions went to the priests, so it's like paying yourself. Like, that's just silly. So God says, God didn't give them the command to give contributions, because they get all the contributions anyway. Then also to top Numbers 19, we have laws about purification as well. Whenever someone touches a dead body, they need to be purified. Whenever someone dies in a tent, everyone who was in the tent with the dead body needs to be purified. If someone was unclean and they did not purify themselves, then they were cut off from the midst of the assembly. Now that can mean two things. One, it could mean they were shunned, they were banished until they cleansed themselves. Or it could mean kind of as an idiom. There are other places in the Bible where the term cut off is used to mean died. So it could mean that if you did not cleanse yourself, you weren't just shunned, you were executed. So that could be another serious matter. The way that this cleansing was done is, one, there was a sacrifice, a heifer, a female cow, is offered as a sin offering, and whoever handles the body or the ashes has to be ceremonially washed with the mixture that we saw back in the book of Leviticus. All this cleansing is done with this water mixture that we saw back in the book of Leviticus. It is water, ashes, hyssop, cedar wood, and scarlet wool, threads of scarlet wool. And like we said way back in Leviticus, it makes actually an effective antibacterial soap with the lye that comes from passing water through ashes, with the hyssop, which is an antiseptic, and the cedar wood, which is an anti-insecticide and an antifungal, and the scarlet wool, which would force you to scrub yourself thoroughly to get all of it off. It makes an antibacterial soap that was highly, highly effective for the ancient world, and it actually kind of rivals some that we have now. So that's a very interesting thing. So that is the end of Israel's time in the wilderness of Paran. In chapter 20, they are going to move on from there and go back out into the desert, back on their traveling to travel towards the plains of Moab, which is where the book is actually going to end right before they go into the promised land, in the plains of Moab. So Israel's time in the wilderness of Paran has definitely not been great. Not been great. And if you're thinking, well, they have had some really bad experiences, but hey, it looks like, it feels like, it sounds like this matter of the authority of God has really been put to rest, and Israel is going to just get their act together. The rest of the way they're going to be faithful to God. They've experienced the consequences of their actions, and they have learned their lesson. You would think, but as I have said many times before in the book of Numbers, just wait. It gets worse. And let's take a look at that next week. In Paran, they rebelled by refusing to enter the land that God promised to give them when it was their opportunity to do so. And Korah and his company rebelled against Moses and Aaron, but in reality, they were rebelling against the Lord. And now Israel is, also the people rebelled again in response to Korah and his company being put to death. And so now Israel is condemned to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. That is 1 year for every day that the spies were in the land. So that entire generation is to die off, and their children, who they were so very worried about, are going to be left to fulfill the commands of God when their children have grown. Well, they have got somewhere to go and never make it to. And a whole 40 years to ultimately not make it there. That's not great. Looks like it's time for them to start walking. Thank you for joining me this evening. I look forward to getting into the book of Numbers again with you next week. For now, have a good night. God bless you all.